test their validity by looking at international legal sources. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at what are the international legal sources, the authoritative international legal sources that govern this question. That's what we're going to do. So let me take a step back. And what is international law? So that's a good question. Unlike, you know what American law is, there's Congress and they pass laws. There is a legislature in Tallahassee and they pass laws. Who is the international legislature? It's not the United Nations. They don't pass laws. There is no international Congress, and there is no international rule-making body. Rather, there are two main ways international agreements are made: treaties and custom. Just like in Jewish law, custom, minhag, can become binding. If countries do things, if all countries regularly do things with a sense of legal obligation, that creates a rule, a customary rule of international law. What do these two things have in common? International law is made by countries. That is to say, countries can only be governed when they agree to a rule that will govern them. Treaties, custom. So what is not international law? Why do I have to give you this little mini sheer in what's international law? Because not everything that has the word international in it makes international law. So for example, you will hear many General Assembly resolutions calling not just Israel's presence in the West Bank illegal. The General Assembly has famously called the very existence of the State of Israel illegal in its Zionism is racism resolution. So if the General Assembly was a law-making body, I could save my voice and step down now and say, we're done. General Assembly has said it's illegal. The General Assembly does not make international law. How do I know that? Is it because I don't like what they say? No. It's because the United Nations Charter, the Constitution of the United Nations, which creates the General Assembly, spells out its powers, and making rules is not one of them, making laws. So what's it mean when the General Assembly votes? Does anyone know about politics, about Congress? You know how sometimes a House will make a one-House resolution. Like the House of Representatives will vote to make Tuesday, Chinese food day, and Wednesday, talk like a pirate day. They have these one-House votes. Those votes aren't laws, because a law has to be passed by both houses and signed by the president. So why do they make these sense of the Senate resolutions or one-House resolutions? To express their opinion. That's what they're doing. Same with the General Assembly. So General Assembly resolutions, you could have 1,000 of them, and you do have 1,000 of them on this subject, and they do not have legal status. What else does not have international legal status that you might hear about a lot? So you may know that the International Court of Justice issued an opinion in a case involving Israel's wall that was being built in the West Bank largely, in which it declared Israel's occupation to be illegal and a violation of international law. It did not offer much analysis for that point. Why is this not a binding statement of international law? It's the International Court of Justice. So the opinion is what's called an advisory opinion. What's an advisory opinion? It's an opinion in a case in which the court, by its own constitution, does not have the authority to issue a binding resolution. What's an advisory opinion? It's advice. Advice. And by the way, let me tell you something about this advisory opinion. The advisory opinion was a response. Who can ask for an advisory opinion? I can't go to the ICJ and say, I'm having a problem writing my international law article. Can you give me an advisory opinion on what international law is? The General Assembly of the United Nations asked for this advisory opinion. And if any of you are planning to go to law school, which Jews tend to do, you'll see there's this amazing trick. When you're arguing in court, the way you frame the question is crucial for the answer. A court really can't answer outside of the framework of the question. Listen to the question that the General Assembly submitted to the ICJ. Bearing in mind that Israel, the occupying power, continues to refuse to comply with international law vis-a-vis its construction of the above-mentioned wall, with all its detrimental implications and consequences, what are the legal consequences from the construction of the illegal wall being built by Israel? So, and the court said illegal, so the input is not, the output is indistinguishable from the input. There was no value added. Again, it's an advisory opinion. We're going to look to binding sources of international law. That is to say, actual treaties, things that countries have made authoritative. Security Council resolutions of certain kind fall into this into this category. Why Security Council resolutions of a certain kind and not General Assembly resolutions? Because the treaty that created the United Nations, which all the countries have signed, says the Security Council can make binding decisions because of the way it's constructed. The General Assembly is just like a town hall meeting. Everyone gets up and says their opinion. Okay, so I said we're not going to talk about who was where first, who came first, but so this is just going to be a blink of an eye in Middle Eastern terms. Let's just go back to 1516, not long. So what's great about this is I can cover 400 years in one slide. From 1516 to 1917, all of the area we're talking about, Lebanon and Syria, Israel, and everything around Israel, belonged to the Ottoman Empire, which was based in Turkey. Islamic, non-Arabic empire. And it ruled much of the Middle East, and up to 1917, all of this clearly belonged to the Ottoman Turk. Those different colored areas are internal administrative divisions of the area of Palestine. You see, they divided it into 3 districts, north and south, which do not look, by the way, as you may notice, like the division between Israel and the West Bank. They look more like the division between the northern, central, and southern commands of Israel. Nobody argued that there was any problem with Ottoman sovereignty up to 1917. So up to 1917, we are clean. That's easy. So we're going to cover the first few thousand years of the world without any concern. Everyone agrees it belonged to the Ottoman Turks. Was that good? Was that nice? Wasn't a question. Ottoman Turks up to 1917. What happened in 1917? And this is crucial. The Ottoman Empire, along with Germany and Austria, were on the losing side of World War I. And as a result of World War I, all of the large, losing, multi-ethnic empires were broken up as part of the peace process. So the Allies had a peace conference, you may have heard of it, in Versailles in 1919, and they said the problem with Austro-Hungary, remember they shot the Serbs, killed the Archduke Ferdinand, so there were all these ethnic minorities living in one pan-ethnic empire. They thought that's a problem. We're going to give each country, we're going to make independent nation states. They did that in Europe, breaking up Austro-Hungary into Poland, into Austria, Czechoslovakia, half the countries you've heard of in Europe now. And they did the same in the Middle East, breaking up the Ottoman Empire into new independent nation states. And this was finally agreed to at a big international conference called San Remo. This was not a colonialist thing. Every country in the world was there. China, Japan, Ethiopia, and they all voted unanimously to create this system in the Middle East of new nation states. Unlike in Europe, where there was some history of parliamentary democracy in these new countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, none of the Middle Eastern countries had a history of democracy. So they were going to be overseen by certain European powers as they transitioned to democracy. Right, so America occupied Afghanistan until they set up a government. Same type of thing. It's a transition occupation. And different European powers were assigned different parts of the former Ottoman Empire to steer to statehood. And this was called the mandate system. The mandate system. And what is central for our purposes is the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. You've often heard of it referred to perhaps as the British Mandate. And the League of Nations, what is the League of Nations? It was the predecessor to the Security Council between the wars. And it had, by its constitution, when it was created after World War I, the authority to make binding international decisions. All the countries agreed to this. And then this body, created by all the countries, came to the following resolution: to favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Palestine was going to be a national home for the Jewish people because of the historical link of the Jews to Palestine. No other people's historical rights to Palestine were noticed, were recognized. The Jewish people, the international community recognizes the historical connection. Who is the League of Nations? You have to understand this. The League of Nations is everyone. The whole world voted for this. The whole world approved this. And Britain was going to create a Jewish state in Palestine. What is Palestine? That whole thing in blue is Palestine. And you'll see it includes the area of Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights, and the entire area that is now called the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. That was all supposed to be used for the creation of a Jewish state under an authoritative international resolution of the border issue. Now, today in college, a lot of people would say to you, why should we care about this League of Nations mandate, this British mandate? First of all, it's old. It was like 100 years ago. Who cares about that? And it sounds like European colonialism because it has the word British in it, and it takes place in the Middle East. So this was just like some favor from like Britain to the Jews. So scratch out that last possibility. The British didn't like the Jews. Nobody liked the Jews. This was part of a much larger settlement. So here's the thing. The only thing you will ever hear about, probably in your lives unless you specialize in this area, is the British mandate for Palestine. The British mandate for Palestine was one of a gazillion mandates issued for these same purposes to create countries on the same day in San Remo as part of the same process. So as you see, Syria was actually called the French mandate for Syria, from which was created Syria and Lebanon. Iraq was called the British mandate for Mesopotamia. And there were other mandates created in other places. There were, I believe, 26 different mandates created, all of which later became countries or multiple countries. What does this mean? Every border that we have here, all of these lines dividing up all of the countries in the Middle East, all of them owe themselves to the League of Nations mandate process. That is to say, how do we know that this is the border between Syria and Israel, or Syria and Iraq, or Syria and Turkey up here? Those were all the borders that were drawn in the League of Mandate process. And in no other context do we say, oh, that was 100 years old and has the word British in it. Let me give you an example. So what France did with this mandate, they did something like what Britain was going to do here. They cut it up into two countries. Lebanon was going to be a majority Christian Arab country, and Syria was going to be a majority Muslim Arab country. Now, Syria, today, if you look in Syria's maps, Lebanon does not exist in Syria's maps, and that's why Syria occupied Lebanon for a long time. Because Syria always said, no, 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 Lebanon's part of us, because we can't go by this 100-year-old mandate thing. Not a country in the world accepted that argument. Do you remember when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait? No, you don't. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and he said, this is part of Iraq. Now, he wasn't just being mean and making things up. He said, before the mandate process, this was a province of Iraq, and just based on the maps that they drew for the British mandate of Mesopotamia, they took that away from us. So it's part of it. Not a single country in the world said, oh yeah, who cares about those 100-year-old mandates with the word British in it? They said, no, these borders are the borders. So if you call into question the borders of the mandate period, you actually call into question the border of every single country in the Middle East. All of these countries were created through the mandate process. And the questions only seem to be raised in the area of Israel. Article 25 of the mandate specifically says, if there are not enough Jews to have a country in this whole big thing, Britain can cut this part off and make a separate thing there. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but anyway, Britain did that right away. And here they created the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The League of Nations mandate doesn't actually say that they can make a different country there. They say they can suspend the mandate, which suggests maybe it's temporary. But Britain cut this off and said, okay, that's no longer Palestine. So all we're left with from 1925 is this part, and that's Palestine, Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. And that is where, under the League of Nations mandate, the Jewish state is supposed to arise. So if the Jordanians, for example, why does Jordan exist? The British mandate for Palestine. The very same mandate. And no one ever doubts Jordan's right to exist or its particular borders. Okay. What is a mandate? A mandate is like a trusteeship. You know, sometimes people have parents with a lot of money. God forbid the parents die. They hire a trustee to make sure the person doesn't get the money until he gives up fast cars and things like this. Okay. That's what this is. By the way, this system, this mandate system, which sounds old and kind of colonial, it continued to exist into the United Nations system after World War II. They just renamed it the Trusteeship Council. And America was a trustee of several countries well into the 90s. So usually in trustee law, what's the concern? Usually you're worried that the trustee, the guy who's sitting around guarding the money, is going to run away with it while the young guy's driving the fast cars. Normally, so you're afraid the trustee will take the money and run. What happened with the British mandate is very unusual. The trustee left the money and ran. What's that mean? Britain, after World War II, Britain was supposed to create a country here. And they said, look, we know that the Arabs and the Jews are going to go at it as soon as we say there can be a Jewish state. Britain was supposed to turn over the keys to the Jews, so to speak. But they said, as soon as we do that, we're going to get caught in the middle of this big Arab-Jewish war. And indeed, that's, you see, they've cut off the Jordan. They've cut off Jordan, and they gave another part to France. So they said, indeed, there's going to be a big war here. We're getting out of here. Jews, if you want your own state, take it yourselves. We're not setting anything up. They were broke after World War II. We're out of here. And they took off. Now, when it became clear, when the British announced that they were leaving, the world understood that there was going to be a big war here. And so the General Assembly, the newly created General Assembly, and this is very important, you're going to hear this quoted all the time, sent fact finders, experts, to the area to try to propose some kind of solution. And they said, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take, okay, so remember, this is Palestine at first, then Britain cuts it in half. So now, and they said, well, we're going to take this, what's left of it, and we're going to cut it into 6 little pieces. And we're going to give the Jews 3 pieces which touch at a corner, and we're going to give the Arabs 3 pieces that touch at the corner. So all that will be left of the Jewish state is this, this, and this, these little parts touching at the corners. Note that Jaffa, have you all been to Jaffa, a very beautiful place in southern Tel Aviv? You should go. That was supposed to be an Arab city in southern Tel Aviv. And as you see, Jerusalem and everything around Jerusalem, Beit Shemesh, this was all going to be Arab. And Jerusalem was going to be an international city supervised by these kind of like Canadian police people. They never arrived, actually, because while they were on the boat, they heard that there was like actually fighting in Jerusalem. And they said, oh, we didn't understand this was like a shooting job. And they turned around and they went home. So everywhere around Jerusalem was going to be Arab country. This was the partition proposal. What legal status does this partition proposal have? None. Why? Because it's the General Assembly, firstly. Secondly, there's another article in the United Nations Charter that says that they cannot change the rights of people under mandates through the United Nations. So Israel, by the way, accepted this deal. The leadership of the Jewish community in Israel said, okay. And the Arabs said no. If everyone had said okay, then it would probably become binding international law, because how does international law get made? By the agreement of countries. So if 2 countries agree to this is going to be our border, that's a binding decision. But they don't agree. And you will often hear that Israel was created, or Israel's legitimacy was recognized by the General Assembly partition proposal, or that in 1947 the UN authorized or recognized Israel. Far from the truth. Israel was already recognized from the League of Nations mandate. Everything in international law with Israel begins with the League of Nations mandate. This doesn't recognize the mandate. It tries to chisel away at the mandate. Now, so the Arabs say no, and a war immediately begins. By the way, there had been other partition proposals. The Jews in the 30s even accepted this suggestion from Britain, where only that tiny little kind of orange area would be Jewish. And the Arabs also said no. Okay. Here we're getting to the so-called 1967 borders, which, as we'll see, have nothing to do with 1967 and are not borders. Okay, so this looks familiar, probably. The Arabs invaded Israel. 5 Arab armies, Egypt coming up here, Transjordan, led by the British, right, the people who love the Jews. The Jordanian army was led by British officers. The Syrians, the Lebanese, the Iraqis walked across Jordan to participate in the fun. The Saudis came, everyone was there. Okay. This is what the situation looked like when the fighting stopped. This line is what you call the green line, right? Every time you hear the phrase the West Bank, Gaza, occupied territory, territory that Israel is occupying, settlements across the green line, it is this line that we're talking about. And there are a few very important observations to make here. Firstly, this line never existed in the history of the world before 1949. What does that mean? That means this line does not track any underlying demographic, historical, political, topographic, or any other kind of realities. That's why it goes through a city. Right? It's not a historical division into administrative units. It doesn't look like any of the maps I showed you before. Where did this line come from? Why did they decide to draw a line like this? This line is simply how far back the Jews managed to push the Arabs. So remember, the Arabs invade from here. Their goal is to conquer this whole thing. So the Egyptians get all the way to the suburbs of Tel Aviv, and then the Haganah, the Israeli army, pushes them back this far, but can't push them all the way out. The Arab armies surround Jerusalem, push all the way up onto the hill here, and then they get stopped and pushed back a little, and pushed halfway out of Jerusalem, but not all the way. In other words, this is simply where the fighting stopped. And indeed, these borders, these so-called borders, how were they fashioned? They were an armistice agreement between the warring armies. What's an armistice agreement? It's not a peace agreement. It's not a border agreement. It's we're going to stop shooting here for a little bit. This is like the ceasefire line. And this is what the armistice demarcation lines are. This is the very document that created those lines for the first time in the history of the world, says it is not to be construed in any sense as a political or territorial boundary. That's the Israeli-Jordanian armistice line. Why do the Jordanians not want it to be construed as a boundary? Because they're saying, we're not done trying to conquer the rest of it. And Israel says, well, we're not done trying to win back this. We see a few important things. The occupation of the West Bank, the military occupation of the West Bank, began in 1949 by Jordan. So remember, League of Nations mandate, up to 1948, all of this area was Palestine, reserved as a Jewish state by the League of Nations mandate. Jordan comes, and in a war that was at the time universally regarded as an aggressive war, chops off this part in an attempt to conquer the whole. So from 1949 to 1967, these areas were under Arab occupation, under the occupation of Egypt and Jordan, respectively. How many United Nations resolutions are there? So every year there's, I would say, a few dozen United Nations documents and resolutions condemning the occupation of the West Bank, the Jewish occupation. How many United Nations resolutions mentioned the Egyptian and Jordanian occupation, and in the case of Jordan, purported annexation? They claim to conquer it and make it part of Jordan, of the West Bank. 0. So it's an interesting thing. So apparently, occupation is not always a bad thing. So what do we see here? First of all, why are they not 1967 borders? Well, first of all, they're not borders. And they were established in 49. 67 is when they were erased. They were established in 49 as an armistice line between the Israeli and Jordanian and Israeli and Egyptian forces. Nothing more. An important point emerges. Only 2 countries in the world, Britain and Pakistan, recognized Jordan's claim to the West Bank between 1949 and 1967. To say that this green line, this line, is in any way sticky, that is to say, that it is the beginning of the basis for Palestinian territorial claims, that Israel's rights are somehow limited or suspended in that area, that Jewish rights are limited or suspended in that area, what does it mean? It is to retroactively legitimize the Arab conquest of 1949. That is, that in 1949, no one thought that Jordan was entitled to take this. But to say now that that is in any way Palestinian territory, or that Israel's claims have been weakened to it, is to retroactively say, you know what, the Arabs get to keep what they won in their war to destroy Israel. It seems hard to see why one would want to do that. 1967, Israel launches a war after Egypt tries to close off shipping to Israel and makes amazing conquests. Amazing conquests. They take Gaza and the West Bank, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the Sinai Peninsula. Wow, it's a lot for 6 days. Crucial point. Israel's international legal claim to the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights is going to be different and perhaps weaker than its claim to Gaza and the West Bank. Why? Why is that? They weren't included in the mandate. What is the West Bank in 1967? What is the status? Was it Jordanian territory? No. Was it Palestinian territory? No, because no one had ever heard of them. What was it? It was that part of the British mandate for Palestine, for a Jewish state in Palestine, that was illegally occupied by Jordan. So Israel has a very good claim to that. What's the international legal basis for Israel's right to this territory in blue? Why does Israel get to have that under international law? British mandate. And so it's the same, not the armistice line, the British mandate. So the West Bank and Gaza Strip, that either belonged to nobody or belonged to Israel and it was taking it back. Those are the two possibilities, I think, under international law. It was not the recognized territory of any other sovereign. The Sinai Peninsula was undisputedly sovereign Egyptian territory. There was no doubt. That is, if in 1966 you said, who does the Sinai Peninsula belong to? Everyone would say Egypt. If you said, who does the West Bank belong to? Nobody would say Jordan, the Arabs. Say it's under Arab occupation. So those are very different legal statuses. Very different legal statuses. That is not to say that Israel is without a basis in international law for holding on to the Golan and the Sinai Peninsula. What is the basis? Defensive conquest. No, so in 1917 they didn't give the Sinai and the Golan. Just what? Defensive conquest. So in international law, you are forbidden from acquiring territory by conquest, by aggressive conquest. Unless you are Arabs trying to conquer the West Bank and Gaza from Israel. That seems to be a major exception. But other than that, or North Vietnam,